Hi, this is Maria Williams. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made this long slender card. It fits perfectly into a size 10 business envelope, and I know you're all familiar with this size because it's the size envelope that you get with your bills so that you can send in your payment. For this card, I'm going to use the seasonal Chums stamp set. I have the wood version here, as well as the coordinating seasonal tags framelits dies. And the sentiment is going to be from the Holly Berry Happiness stamp set. I'm also going to use circles from the Layering Circles Frameless dies. I'm using the circle that is 2 5/8, that's the largest one, and then the one that's just a little bit smaller, and then one that's 2 sizes smaller. And I'm also using the little scalloped one to add just a little bit of black to the top part of the card. Before I get going on today's card, I wanted to show you this card I made previously. I used the Seaside embossing folder to create sort of waves of snow, and I also used the Woodland embossing folder for the trees and then inked them up with a brayer and some craft ink. And I heat embossed with glittery red embossing powder onto vellum and put the sentiment on. I'm going to use the same colors on my card, so I wanted to show you this one since I don't have a video. And now I'm going to get right into the new card. I've made some notes. This is a size 10 business envelope. The dimensions are 4 1/8 by 9 1/2. And so my finished card is going to be 3 3/4 by 9 1/8. And so the card base that I need to cut is 7 1/2 inches by 9 1/8 inches. I want the card base to be really sturdy, so I'm using thick white cardstock, and again I'm cutting it to 7 1/2 by 9 1/8, and then I'm just going to score it at 3 3/4 inches. I've cut a piece of real red cardstock to the same dimensions as the card base, and now I'm going to figure out where I'm going to cut the circles. As I mentioned earlier, the largest circle I'm using is 2 5/8 inches in diameter, and then the next size up is the smaller one, and the smallest one is a couple sizes smaller to fit the sentiment and the reindeer and the snowman as snugly as possible while allowing it to move. Basically, what I'm trying to do here is to center the circles in the middle of the card and spread them out so that they're evenly distributed. I'm going to use a little bit of painter's tape. I've done a lot of painting. I have some left over, so I thought I would use it to hold my dies in place. I am planning to use my magnetic platform, but even then, I just want to make sure that nothing moves. I'm running everything through my Big Shot with a basic sandwich, and then I'm just going to pop out the circles. And while I have my Big Shot here, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the reindeer and the snowman with the dies. Now you may be wondering why I'm doing this before stamping, but I'm going to show you why in a minute. I'm also cutting out the little tag from the same die set, and I'm cutting 2 at one time. I've just layered 2 pieces of cardstock on top of each other. And because this is Whisper White, I can go ahead and cut 2. I don't know that I would try it with thick white cardstock or any of the thicker cardstocks, but it cuts fine for the regular ones. So here's why I cut out my shapes first. I've decided that whenever I'm getting stamps and dies that coordinate, I'm going to get the stamps on wood blocks. I have a little trouble sometimes lining up the dies with the images and getting them to cut just the way I want them. So what I decided to do was to take a piece of scrap cardstock, the thickest that I had, and line it up with my Stamp-A-Majig and with my stamp right in the corner. Then I die cut them very carefully, and now I have a template so that anytime I'm going to stamp and die cut this particular image, all I have to do is cut it ahead of time, and I could do as many as, you know, if you're doing multiples, this is great because you don't have to line up the die with each image that you've stamped. You can cut several die cuts and then just pop them into the template with a Stamp-A-Majig lined up in the corner and go ahead and stamp. If you were using the clear stamps, not the photopolymer, but the clear, you wouldn't really be able to do this because every time you mount the image onto your block, it's going to sit in a different place on your block. But by having a wood block, the stamp is always in the same place, and you can just set yourself up a template that you can use each time. Here I'm using Memento Black Tuxedo Black ink to stamp my images. It gives you a nice clean image, and this is good if you are using alcohol markers, but I'm going to be using Stampin' Write markers today. For my little sentiment tag, I'm going to use a stamp from the stamp set that says Merry Christmas, but I wanted a little something in the background, and I thought a little Christmas tree would be good, and I didn't have one, a stamp, so I decided to take the die from the set and die cut myself a tree out of fun foam. And here's the die, and as you can see, it cut through really cleanly. This is the fun foam that I used, and it cut through. Even though it's the thicker fun foam, it cut perfectly. So I did kind of season the stamp a little bit. I inked it up and stamped off a couple of times so that I would get a little bit of ink saturation. And then I'm just taking my Pear Pizzazz ink, inking up my stamp, and then I'm just going to stamp in the middle of my tag. I'm going to stamp on both of the tags that I cut out because these are going to be back to back, just like the other die cuts have a front and a back. I need a front and a back for the sentiment, so I'm just stamping both of them. Next, I'm taking the Merry Christmas stamp from the stamp set, and I decided I was going to eyeball this, and it didn't turn out as well as I had hoped. It was a little bit off center. So for the other side of the tag, I decided to go ahead and use my Stamp-A-Majig. For the stamps in my wood stamp set that don't have coordinating dies, I have set myself up a template that I can use with a Stamp-A-Majig. So I took a piece of window sheet and stamped with StazOn ink all of the sentiments in the stamp set so that I don't have to use the Stamp-A-Majig sheet and stamp it on there first. So as you can see, this fits perfectly into the Stamp-A-Majig corner, and it's already ready to go. Much better. I went ahead and cut the smallest scalloped circle out of black cardstock, and now I'm just using my fine tip glue pen to apply some glue to it, and I'm going to layer the two tags that I have already stamped. Since the tags have a little hole, I went ahead and after I had layered everything, punched a hole with my paper piercer, and in hindsight I wish I hadn't done that. I could have just left the black cardstock as it was, because then I decided to add a rhinestone in the center anyway, and because the hole was there originally, I felt like I had to thread my the thread that I used through the hole, and I would have rather sandwiched it in between the layers, and this will make a little bit more sense later on in the video. I'm now ready to color my images, so I've grabbed some Stampin' Write markers. I'm using Real Red and Pear Pizzazz for the snowman's scarf and gloves, and also for the holly that's on the snowman's hat. And then I'm going to use Basic Gray for the hat. I actually started to do a little bit of a highlight with some smoky slate and the basic gray for the hat, but I don't think it's really worth it, so I would just color the whole thing gray. And then I used smoky slate for the little bunny that's next to the snowman, and of course I'm doing the front and the back at one time. And I do want to mention that I have this sped up to about 500%, so it did take me a little while because some of the details, some of the areas that I'm coloring are so small. I did take a fair amount of time to color the images in. To give the snowman a little bit more depth, I did take a soft sky marker and just kind of went around the rounded areas of the snowman. I wasn't real careful. I just added a little bit just all around the rounded edges. For the nose, I used the pumpkin pie marker, and then I took a black jelly roll pen and went over the eyes and the buttons just so that they would stand out a little bit more. It also gives it a tiny bit of shine. Then a little bit more touch up with the soft sky marker on the back, and the snowman is done. So I'm just folding it and then very carefully cutting off the tag part of the die cut. You could, if you wanted to, hang these die cuts by the tag hole. That's kind of what that is there for. But because they don't hang straight, I decided to cut that part off and then just sandwich my thread in between the two layers. To color the reindeer, I'm using the crumb cake marker, and I believe I used early espresso that may have been chocolate chip for the antlers and for the feet. And since the reindeer is a larger surface that's getting colored with one color, I did kind of go over it a couple of times to make sure that the color was even. But don't keep going over and over it. Give it a chance to dry after you've done a couple of coats, and as it dries, the color should even out. For the reindeer's bow, I used real red, and for the bell, I used So Saffron. And then once I was done coloring both sides, I went ahead and did the same thing, folded the die cut in half and cut off the little hanger part. Now that the main pieces for my card are ready, I'm going to start working on the card base and assembly. So I'm taking the front panel and I'm placing it down onto my card base with the side that I put the dies up against facing up. You can see the little indentations from the dies, and I don't want that side to show. So basically I'm using the front panel as a stencil. So I'm just very, very lightly sponging some Pool Party ink onto the circles, and when I'm done with that little bit, I'm going to remove the front panel and go ahead and apply more color in those areas. To attach my die cuts to the card, I decided that I was going to use the silver metallic thread. It is fairly sturdy, but if you don't have that, or if you're going to give this card to maybe a younger child that you think might rip the metallic thread off, you might want to use something like a thin baker's twine or something like that, but this is pretty sturdy thread. The adhesive I'm using to attach the thread is the tear and tape. So I'm putting a piece on the top and then a piece in between the circles. My die cuts are going to be dangling, but if you wanted yours to just be suspended, you could put another piece of tear and tape on the bottom, between the bottom circle and the edge, and just run your thread all the way from the top to the bottom, and then just attach your die cuts to the thread. I had originally intended to add adhesive sheet to the back of my cardstock before cutting my die cuts out, but I forgot, so instead I'm going to use tear and tape to attach the thread to the die cuts. I cut the two pieces of the snowman apart, and then I'm putting tape on both pieces. I really want to make sure that the thread stays put. So I'm adding adhesive to both sides, and I'm going to do the exact same thing with the reindeer. I'm going to cut the two pieces apart. This will allow me to run the thread straight down the middle of the die cut. So again, I'm adding adhesive to both sides of the reindeer, and then I'm going to sandwich the thread in between those two pieces and press the two pieces together. And actually, before I press the pieces together, I did add some liquid adhesive. I don't want the edges of the die cuts to come apart. I want them to be glued together all around, so that liquid adhesive will help with that. Since my Merry Christmas tag already had a hole in it, I went ahead and threaded the metallic thread through it. And then I'm just going to take the loose ends and remove the backer from my tear and tape and stick the thread to the adhesive. And I'm running the adhesive right through it, and then I'm bending it back and gluing it some more, again, just to make sure that that thread doesn't go anywhere. I'll do the exact same thing with the reindeer and with the snowman, and then I'm going to attach this front panel onto the front of my card. To do that, I'm going to use the foam strips. I love these foam strips. They give you a little bit more space than dimensionals, and you don't have to, remove all those individual backers. You can just remove all the backer in one strip. I wanted to make sure that my front panel didn't sag anywhere, so all the way across, I doubled up the foam tape, and then on the sides I just placed one long strip all the way down. Once all my foam strips are in place, I need to attach this front panel to the card base. And instead of removing all the different liners and then placing it on the front of the card, I decided to just remove one of the long ends and then attach it to the card, making sure that I had it placed properly, and then remove all the other backers and then press the panel onto the card. This was a little bit tricky because the die cuts kept trying to fall into the card in between the front panel and the card base, so I did have to be really careful that I didn't press it down until I had all my die cuts away from the card base. At this point, the card was looking a little bit plain, so I decided to take some scraps of diamond glimmer paper, which is essentially white, and cut out some of the snowflakes from the same framelit set. I cut 3 of each. I wasn't sure how many I was going to use, but I figured I wasn't going to use more than 6. And then I just kind of played around with the layout for a while until I settled on the final layout for the snowflake, which actually ended up changing. Once I thought the card was totally complete, I went back and pulled them off and placed them in slightly different locations. To add a little bit more detail, I decided to take a sponge and some white craft ink and sponge around the circle openings and also around the edges of the card. And then last but not least, I added a rhinestone to the center of the Merry Christmas tag. Now here is a do as I say, not as I do portion of the video. I waited to stamp my greeting on the inside of the card until I had already assembled the front. And this would normally be a very easy task, but of course I couldn't open the card base all the way. So when I stamped the greeting, I got a big smudge on the edge of my card. So I decided to cut a couple more snowflakes and add a little bit of pool party ink to them, and then add them to the 2 sides of the sentiment to cover up the smudge. In the end, it added a little bit more detail to the sentiment and made it look a little bit more finished, so it wasn't terrible. But I always try to stamp my sentiment before I assemble the front of my card, and I don't always remember. I added some Wink of Stella to finish off the snowflakes, and that finished off my card. Here's a final look at the finished card. I hope you will consider giving this size card a try. Nobody expects to get a greeting card in this size envelope, so it's a nice change. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, and I hope you'll join me for the next video. Thanks for watching. If you would like to see more pictures or purchase any of the products used in this video, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com.